very, very excited about this conversation. I think it is one of, if not the most pressing items facing our community here. And I'm really excited to have this conversation and see what lies ahead. So John, welcome.
Thanks very much for having us. I just want to make sure everybody sees Ron back there. Ron, he's hard to see. Can you stand up a little higher? Ron's our deputy over consumer advocacy, and so after the meeting, if anybody has additional questions, we'll stick around for a bit. Please feel free to ask us any additional questions you have, and if we can't answer them, we'll get an answer for you and be in touch. So thank you for inviting us, and happy to be here.
Awesome, fantastic. And so first and foremost, I want to thank St. Bernard Economic Development Foundation. We teamed up with them. Sarah's their rep here. But we just want to thank them for this beautiful space that they're letting us use here. It's fantastic. This is a free event. There's no gurus, pitches, sales pitches, anything. We interview people who are in real estate, doing real estate, or in a case like this, an industry expert. So we meet the last Wednesday of every single month. We're right here in this location, and then we have the Facebook page. If you join us on any of these signs, you can scan the QR code and it'll take you right there. With that being said, let's dive in. I know we have a lot to cover, and I'm sure we have a couple of questions in the audience as well. But Commissioner Temple has talked about how the insurance crisis didn't happen overnight, and we won't get out of it overnight, right? What are some things that are being done, and what's maybe a realistic timeline for us to get out of this storm?
Great question. So, Commissioner Temple took office January of 2024. The previous commissioner had been in office for about 18 years. And then, as you all know, we had about a dozen insurance companies fail following Laura, Delta, Zeta, and Ida. And then in addition to those 12 that failed, we had probably 24 more voluntarily leave the market because they were unable to make enough money to continue doing business here. Probably more than 24, honestly. So when Commissioner Temple came in, he came in with a pretty strong push on the need for significant, meaningful property insurance reform, which I'll get into that in just a second. That was kind of the focus of session last year. This year, we're continuing that push on property insurance reform, as well as resiliency efforts, which I'm sure we'll get into later. This year, we're more focused on auto reform. But last year is really where the major reforms were made. Administratively, he made a lot of changes at the department, reducing administrative burden, making the regulatory process simpler so that insurance companies had a kind of a friendlier experience when they contacted the department. We also tried to put a stronger focus on consumer education and support so that we could answer questions better. We developed a new app called LDI Connect, which I'll go ahead and pitch right now. LDI Connect on Apple or Google Play. So all this is aimed at empowering consumers to know that shopping around can help you get a better price on your any policy really, but especially your homeowner's policy. Making a better environment for insurance companies. And then at the legislature last session, several laws, most prominently the 3-year rule was amended. Previously, a homeowner's insurance company, if you had been a policyholder with that company for 3 or more years, they really could not cancel you after that. There are a few exceptions. At the time, it was intended as a consumer protection, right? You think, okay, well, I've been with company A for 5 years. It's maybe tougher to get a policy in South Louisiana than it is in other parts of the country. So the state thought it would be a good idea to kind of lock those policies in. We were the only state in the country, the only government in the world that we're aware of that had something like that prohibited an insurance company from dropping a policy. So what happened is the insurance companies got overburdened in South Louisiana, so their risk was not balanced correctly. We think it's a big part of the reason so many companies failed after 2020 and 2021. And additionally, it's why kind of the only way to get out of that was if you leave the state entirely or raise your deductibles for the entire book of business across the state. So we kind of trapped insurance companies into a corner with that. That's why Commissioner Temple brought or supported legislation last year to amend that so that folks are grandfathered in. before August 1, 2024. So if you had been with your insurer for 3 years, you maintain that 3-year rule policy, with an exception that up to 5% of each company's policies can be dropped going forward every year. That was kind of the centerpiece of what was done last year. There were other tweaks to kind of streamline the process for insurance companies doing business in Louisiana. But I will say, we were looking at what Florida had done over the past several years on property reform to see how long it might take to see the actual real-world effects of those changes. Florida started their push for reform in late 2022 and really started seeing rates stabilize in mid-2024. So we were expecting about a 2-year, gap, I guess you would say, in between the legislation being passed and the benefits being noticeable. Fortunately, we actually have started to see positive signs already. We've had 10 newly licensed homeowners insurance companies enter the market since last year's legislative session began, which is a big jump up from recent years. We've seen, in 2024, we saw property insurers taking fewer and less costly rate increases. So in 2022 and 2023, the statewide average rate increase for a homeowner's policy was about 14%. So, I'm not going to try to do math because I don't do that, but you get the picture. In 2024, that number was cut in half to 6%. So the trend is going in the right direction. The average is still an increase, but it's a much smaller increase than we've been used to. So we're going to see what happens in 2025 on that front and go from there. And then lastly, we actually had about 8 insurance companies take a rate decrease so far. That's homeowners, residential insurance companies so far this year. I think all of 2024, there was maybe 3 of those, and all of 2023, there was like 2. So that's a pretty significant step forward in the right direction as well.
Wow, yeah, it's good news. And you'd mentioned, you mentioned a couple of things in terms of making this a favorable environment for insurance companies. And I think, we've seen in the news or whatever about maybe that faced with some opposition and the other side saying, oh, we're too friendly to insurance companies, right? But I think the rationale is, if we want insurance to be here, we have to be an attractive place for insurance companies to come, right? And I think that's the rationale behind some of these legislative changes. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about why it is a good idea to make it better and easier for insurance companies versus, I guess the other side is we need to protect the citizens at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fantastic question. At the end of the day, I think what you could say is there are valid opinions on every side of this issue. On one side, you might think that the state or the federal government should provide essentially homeowners coverage to everybody in the country, right? So basically state-controlled insurance. On the other side, free market system. We have a free market system. Louisiana has a free market system. Every state in the country has a free market system. Louisiana is I would say, probably a more free market state than the average state, right? Just because of the nature of, our voter base and our legislature and historically who's won elected office here. So we have a free market system. The federal government in 1945 pushed the regulation of insurance to the state level. So with the exception of flood and a lot of aspects of health insurance, we do regulate insurance at the state level. So we have to understand that the foundation of our insurance system is, for now, free market. So we have to do whatever we can to increase competition in the market. And insurance companies are just like any other business in that they exist because they're trying to return a profit on whatever business they're in. Now, there are also some legitimate differences with insurance. If you own a home with a mortgage, you have to have insurance. If you drive a car, you have to have insurance. So it's not, a jar of jelly, you have an option there. But the way our system is set up, we need to encourage competition to make sure folks have as many options as they can for good coverage with the best rate. In any state I think California is a good example of a state that makes it extremely difficult for insurance companies to price their policies at I would say, an actuarially sound rate. They have a lot more barriers between the step where the insurance company requests a rate and it's granted. And if you you might be surprised to know that any state's doing worse than we are when it comes to insurance, but California is easily doing worse than we are, and it's not necessarily just a result of the recent wildfires they had there. So I think that's probably the best way to explain our current situation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think in real estate terms, it seems like it's fundamentally supply and demand issue, right? We have this fixed demand. Most homeowners need insurance, but very little supply, and so the solution seems to be how do we leverage to get more supply to even out the supply and demand dynamic, right?
That's right, because there's a certain number of companies writing. As companies exit, the companies that are still here, if it's a very healthy market, they might be able to take on more policies as those competitors leave. But in a market like ours, which has not been healthy for several years, the companies that are doing business here are going to be very conservative in terms of taking on additional risk, especially when we're talking about the coastal region of the state, which is, of course, the most risky part of the state. And that's why we have Citizens. That's why Citizens was created as a last resort option. And that's why it was necessary, right? You know, we talked earlier about how, well, you have to choose whether you want to have, do you want to have government-run insurance, do you want to have private-run insurance, and the Citizens model, which is also based on Florida, is kind of a happy medium where, in theory, in a healthy market, there's going to be a handful of people that are unable to find a policy on the private market. So that's why the Commissioner Temple and everybody at the department is more than willing to use the term crisis to describe the state of our current market. It's because we have so many people who are unable to find a policy, and when they do, it's often unaffordable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, it being pushed down to the state level, I think in 1945. I've heard of people talk about this idea of an NFIP, or nationalized subsidy for homeowners insurance, right? Is there any actual wheels to that? Is that like a realistic, reasonable thing, or is it just kind of fairyland type stuff?
Sure. So, I mean, I would never want to discourage, or not that what I say right now would discourage or encourage anybody to do anything, but I would never want to discourage legislators and congressmen and women from attempting to think of ways to fix, insurance or improve insurance. So I won't say that there's no conceivable, way that the federal government could help people across the country have access to more affordable insurance. What I would say is that the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, is the best example we have right now of what it looks like when the federal government gets involved at a high level in insurance. The NFIP was in the hole $20 billion. They had all that forgiven. They're in the hole $20 billion again, and now they're raising everybody's rates dramatically. There's several issues with the NFIP. The main one right now is a transparency issue. So they just recently switched to something called Risk Rating 2.0, which means that if you have a policy through the NFIP, in theory, the NFIP insurance company, or the NFIP, is actually individually rating your property for its individual risk, which is probably the correct way to go about it, because even if you're a half a mile from somebody else, there could be, whether it's what you've done to your home to increase mitigation, or if it's there's a levy that protects your home but doesn't protect somebody else. The problem is we have no access, and our Congress people can't get this, the insurance commissioner can't get it, the governor can't get it, other states are in the same boat. We have no idea how they're actually determining what each person's individual risk is. And the reason that's a problem is Louisiana and other states have invested a lot of money in resiliency and mitigation projects. So we don't know to what extent those projects are being accounted for. And I think that we would need to see the actual data and process to determine whether these new ratings and premiums that are being assigned are actually accurate or not. But back to your original question, I don't think we've seen proof that there is a federal model that we could actually switch to and have reason to think it would work out very well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because Flood Risk 2.0 hasn't been, at least from a real estate perspective, necessarily received excellently. Like, I know anecdotally, my flood insurance went up something 300-400% because it lapsed, right? And when you're like, hey, what happened? What's the difference from this house to that house? And I think proximity to water is a factor. But the canal by my house is one like this. I'm like, dude, like if I flood from that canal, all of St. Bernard Parish is flooded. So, but yeah, so it's a tough one. What about, I know they're in legislative session right now, and one of the things I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard is they're looking at maybe some sort of tax credit for insurance premiums. Is that only on the auto side, or is that something potentially maybe in the future being looked at on the homeowner side as well?
So there's several tax benefit bills going through the legislature. Most of the ones that the commissioner is interested in and supporting have to do with tax benefits around the fortified homes program. And I'll come back to that in a second. I believe the ones you're referencing are to essentially offset a certain amount of the premium we pay every year by providing a tax credit to the individual policyholder. I don't know necessarily that the department would have a particular opinion on that bill because it's more of a budget issue, but I think there's a fiscal note on it, and I think it's $1.5 billion or $2.5 billion or something like that. I mean, it's really kind of there's that bill, nothing's gonna happen with that bill. What I would say is there are several bills to provide tax, I hate talking about taxes. I'm a words guy, right? So the numbers and all this stuff. I do my own taxes, but they're simple. Basically, if you put a fortified roof on your home outside of the grant program, the state is going to provide a tax benefit to you for doing that, so that you can offset the costs that you incur up to, I want to say about $10,000 is what the legislation is. So if you get a grant, the state will give you $10,000, and then you're responsible for anything above that. You can, I believe that that legislation is worded so that if you put a new fortified roof on your house with the grant, but it costs you $15,000, you can probably get that tax incentive for the gap. That'll probably be worked out in the legislative process. But those are some tax benefits that I really think have a chance of encouraging people to fortify their homes, which is one of the things that we must do if we want to see the entire region become more insurable and therefore more competition, more affordable rates for property insurance. And
is there I guess, I don't know if herd immunity is a good analogy, right? But is there a critical mass where if a certain amount of people do fortify and we kind of build this resilient housing stock, so to speak, it benefits everybody? Or is it just you have a fortified roof, you get the discount, it doesn't impact anybody else? Yes, the answer is yes. So that's one of the things I like to say is there are multiple reasons that we have the Fortified Homes program going. One is the individual, right? So if you're an individual and you receive the fortified roof, you're almost certainly going to get a discount on your insurance policy. You are going to get one, but sometimes when you renew your policy, if there's other factors that drive your rate up so much, it actually kind of overlaps with the discount, so it looks like you didn't get a discount, right? So that's important to know. But the individual is going to get that discount. They're going to have a more insurable home, which means if you go shop your insurance, you're likelier to get better and more quotes. And then also, of course, you have a stronger roof. So if you are hit by a hurricane, you're less likely to have to get out. Your possessions are more likely to be saved. So all around, that's a good program for the individual. But it's also great for the state as a whole, because as we've seen in Alabama, and Alabama does some different things. They've had the grant program, but they also changed their building codes in their coastal parishes so that new constructions in Alabama in the coastal area have to have a fortified roof, which is something that I believe the commissioner would be willing to support in Louisiana. And we're kind of in that's a huge not right now, and we're trying to work out with building codes, enforcement, wind mitigation, incentive. There's just a ton of things that we're all trying to work toward to make sure that we're doing everything we can to incentivize stronger building. But yet, in short, yes, if enough people end up with a fortified roof in Louisiana, that makes the entire state more attractive to the insurance industry, and eventually homeowners will benefit from the insurability of the region, even if they don't individually have the fortified roof. Nice. And I know this came up at the Parish Council, can't remember if it was this group or the previous, but to pass legislation to require permits for re-roofs, and they had someone from Louisiana Home Builders Association who, I think the way he described it was that a fortified roof is a whisper away from what the new code calls. So he's like, hey, if you're doing a new roof, you would almost, the way he made it seem, you would almost be a fool to not do fortified if you're putting a new roof on.
Right, and so I would describe it as more of a whistle away. It's a little bit louder than a whisper, But the building codes, the latest went into effect in 2021. So what he was saying is that those building codes are about 95% of the way to meeting the fortified standard. And insurance companies actually will give you a better rate on your home if your roof meets the 2021 building code versus the prior one. So, for example, if you had your roof replaced in 2022 and the roof meets the new building code, then sometimes your insurer finds out about that from your agent. Sometimes they don't. Okay. That's what it's a wind mitigation survey is what that is for, and that will actually be that's a way for you to kind of inform your insurance company that you had the roof done and you should receive. It's not really a discount, but it's kind of a re-rating of your home to recognize the fact that you now have a stronger roof. I was going to make a point about something you said a little bit earlier on what his comment was, but I can't remember. I will say really quickly, the wind mitigation survey is a really strong tool. So if you have a home but you don't have a fortified roof, if it's a newer home or a newer roof, or you've done other things on your property to mitigate against storm risk, if you download our app, LDI Connect, you can find out about the wind mitigation survey. We have a tile on the app, and it kind of walks you through the process of how that works. It does cost a few $100s to do that process, and so we always encourage people to contact their agent before they start that process to kind of discuss the property itself and see what might be caught in that wind mitigation survey, and if so, what the effect of that might look like on your policy, because you don't want to waste your time and your money pursuing something when you could just have a conversation on the front end.
Yeah, and I think that's a big misconception with the wind mitigation survey, right? People say, well, I got one. You told me to get one, Mike, and I got one. I spent $200 and it didn't affect my insurance at all. And well, it only helps if you have the things that the form is looking for, right? If you have a fortified, and it doesn't need to be a fortified roof, but I think like hurricane shutters, hurricane straps, there's a lot of nuance to it, but if you don't have any of those things, then the form's not going to do you any good.
And we also are actively, meaning the LDI is actively in the process of looking at other states that have recently upgraded their wind mitigation forms and their process for working with the surveyors who operate those who perform those surveys. So we're actually trying to kind of revamp that whole process, do a better job of promoting it, and then making the process a little bit more simple for people to go through. So hopefully we'll be releasing some information on that later this year.
Nice, that's fantastic. There's a lot of good info. I don't have the app, I'll look into that, but there's a lot of really good info on the website. I was looking earlier this week, and y'all do have a lot of great resources there, so definitely encourage y'all to check that out. For an investor in the room that's looking at South Louisiana, should they feel confident looking 10 to 15 years down the road when it comes to insurance specifically?
That's a tough question, isn't it? Right? I guess that's why you asked it. So 10 to 15 years. So what I would say is this: Alabama has been doing, so this is going to come back to the fortified situation and kind of the effects on their market. Right. Once they started that program. Before I get into that, though, I'll note Alabama has 2 coastal parishes. Right. We have, I don't know how many we have. We have a lot. Yeah. We have a very densely populated coastal zone relative to Alabama. So it's not a one-to-one. I'm not trying to say our experience is going to be exactly like Alabama's has been, but they've been at fortified. They've been working on fortified encouraging fortified roofs for close to 15 years. Their grant program has been kind of operating for I think about 10. And so what they've done. They've got about 60,000 fortified roofs in their state right now. They had Hurricane Sally came through, and not only did the fortified roofs actually, at least based on the studies that have been done following Hurricane Sally to see how those fortified roofs held up, the fortified roofs held up well. They reduced a lot of what I guess you would say would have been projected losses without the fortification, and their insurance rates have kind of held steady relative to ours over that period of time. But their grant program has been so successful that now in Alabama it's something like 4 out of every 5 new fortified roofs are done outside of the grant program, because that's the only way it's sustainable. The state can't afford to put $10,000 into everybody's roof. So that's kind of what we're trying to do is, and that was the third thing I meant to mention earlier with, the fortified roof is beneficial for the individual and then the community, but it's also kind of basically a PSA to the state. It's a proof of concept. So if you can afford to do it yourself, or if you're building a new home and you can wrap that into your expenses, you should, because you're going to see a return and the state's going to see a return. And so if we can get those fortified roofs up, we've been really encouraged actually over the past, I want to say on, let's say, December 31st, 2023, there were fewer than 900 roofs in the state that were fortified outside of the grant program. So 900. Since then, we are at, 3,800 done outside the grant program. Wow. So in just like 14 months, we've had quadruple the number of people out of their own pocket put a fortified roof on, and that's where we need to see the growth. Yeah. And I would say, thanks to Alabama's experience, right? We've learned from Alabama. They've been very gracious in helping us, I hate to say. They've been very gracious in helping us out, walking us through what they've done, and we have learned from them and are implementing from all their lessons, right? We are experiencing tremendous growth in Louisiana in the fortified roofs compared to what Alabama did. Again, thanks to them. But I think that that's an extremely positive sign that, at least residentially, Louisiana is doing what it needs to do to induce that exposure, increase the insurability of the market. We need to see more commercial resilience work being done. We're going to have a topic on that at our annual conference this August. And that's a big piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, we also need to see these kind of infrastructure projects, coastal projects that really help prevent large loss, whether it's levees or pump systems, those sorts of things. Yeah. So, but I think that is being understood. We've been extremely encouraged by the amount of support that the fortified program has received at the legislature, both sides of the aisle, all over the state. I think people really understand that this is necessary. Usually in a state like Louisiana, putting $30 million into a grant program is kind of a tough sell, but we found that people were looking for something like that. And so I would be optimistic, but if we don't continue pushing for resilience projects, and if we don't continue keeping up with other states in terms of how we regulate insurance companies and that sort of thing, then it's very easy to fall behind. We could do well for 3 or 4 or 5 years in a row, but if we slow down and kind of say, okay, we're good, 3 years later we could be back in the same boat.
Yeah, I'm all for being grateful to Alabama until football season starts.
Well, I hesitate to say that I'm actually a Razorback fan. So
really?
Okay. I know that's not threatening or anything. So
well, this has been fun. Yeah, that's a good brotherly rivalry there. And I think looking forward, that success is, some of it is in our control, a lot of it's not, right? And I've heard rumblings, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard rumblings of insurance agents saying, hey, if we can squeak by this hurricane season and get lucky, we're thinking rates will kind of start to dip down. We'll start to see some impacts there. So I'm curious your thoughts on, in that scenario, if we do get lucky this hurricane season, is that the case? And then, God forbid, we do get some sort of moderate hurricane, knock on wood. Does that just start the clock over? Are we back to where we started? You know what I mean? In those two scenarios, I'd like to get your thoughts.
So let's kind of take ourselves out of the current insurance crisis we're in, right? And just say, in a vacuum, assuming we didn't have Laura, Delta, Zeta, Ida, we don't have this insurance crisis that's going on. What you would expect to see in a healthy market is, because the cost of materials is always increasing, you would expect to see a small increase in your premium every year. Even if you didn't have hurricanes or anything, right? You'd expect a 1 or 2% increase. I think once things settled down after Katrina and until Laura, or I should say the effects of Laura, you saw between probably 1 and 3% average annual increase on homeowners policies across the state, and that's just a result. Like any other business, the cost of things are going to go up slowly over time. So So that's what you'd expect to see. And then if you, in that scenario, if you get hit by a hurricane, you would see a spike, right? It's usually maybe a year later in the premiums as insurers kind of seek to recover those extraordinary losses. But then it recovers and it goes back to that kind of slow uptick. What we have now is we are in a crisis, and I think that the industry is basically watching to see if Louisiana's reform mindset that we've been in for about a year and a half, 2 years now is going to stick or not. Because if it's going to stick, I think that there will be faith from them. And another part of this puzzle is, piece of this puzzle is the reinsurance markets, which are insurance for insurance companies, which, they're based internationally. They're not regulated. They're basically investors, right? So there's something y'all have in common. They operate mostly out of London and Bermuda and Toronto and places like that, New York City. They are just looking for a place to invest their money and make as big of a return as they can. And so similar to standard insurance companies, they are watching what Louisiana does, because the more we do to mitigate our risk, the safer their investment is whenever they send money or whenever they put money on the line with standard insurance companies who are insuring the coastal zone. And so our target audience with all this reform is the insurance companies, the reinsurers, obviously the policyholders and the consumers. But we need to be steady and predictable, and we need to maintain a commitment to reforming the market, at least keeping up with other states, and then continuing the resiliency push. And I think that's how I would answer your question, is we're kind of in a flux right now because of the extraordinary circumstances. But if we continue this push, I'm optimistic that we can get to a place where insurance is available and affordable. And there might be a bigger role than we've been used to for things like Citizens, where I think historically in healthy times, Citizens would have 30 or 40,000 policyholders statewide. So maybe that baseline number would be higher because there would be more areas of the state that don't have access, but it would be manageable, in theory. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, nice, thank you. Two more. I want to make sure we have time for in case anybody in the audience has questions. But two questions as we kind of land the plane here are, if things do get better, let's say we get lucky, good hurricane season, we continue to, what's that? What's that?
When things get better.
Yeah, sorry. They continue to get better. Do you expect that we will see improvement across the board statewide, or will certain parishes or regions kind of lag behind and maybe not quite see as much? Like, I think he made a good point, right? Like, if things get better, will they get much better for Covington versus St. Bernard, or would kind of the rising tide lift all ships, so to speak?
So yes to both, because so insurance companies basically operate at the state level, right? So that's why if you're in North Louisiana, your policy, you probably pay a little bit more for your premium than you would if we did not have so much coastal exposure and population density in South Louisiana. So they kind of, the good risk, bad risk, they kind of level that out. But I will say, to my point earlier about Citizens maybe needing to be have more policies in it. Another piece of that is, and I think that this is pretty clear, following Laura, Delta, Zeta, Ida, and the 12 companies that failed, there might have been a lot of underpriced policies out there, right? Because people are like, okay, and this is not the policyholder's fault, right? I'm not saying that, but if you find an insurance policy and it's the least expensive option, so you purchase that policy, and you're in a very risky spot. And I think that's what happened is you had a lot of these insurance companies either priced their policies too low, or they didn't purchase enough reinsurance, or both. And so that's one of the reasons these companies failed. Now again, it was an extraordinary circumstance where you had Laura and Ida in a 13-month period. In Delta and Zeta, it's like 800,000 claims. I mean, it was really an absurd situation, but it happened. And so that should have been something that was contemplated. So all that to say, I think that the benefits of this reform will be statewide, and it will not, I don't think there's going to be any areas of the state that don't benefit from it, but I think that the floor on insurability might come up a bit, which means more people into citizens potentially, or what you might have called an affordable insurance policy in 2018 might be more expensive, even relative to the inflation over that time period. But I think that's because we maybe had a false idea of what an affordable insurance policy might have looked like back then.
Sure. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then my last question before I turn it over to the crowd. I'm sure you get a lot of the same questions over and over again. What is a question that you wish more people would ask? Or this is just kind of your open plug or opportunity to plug anything you'd like there.
A question that I wish I got more often. When is LSU finally going to beat Arkansas?
Fair enough.
I never hear that question. It's usually the opposite. I think that the question we don't get enough is, we actually do get it a lot, but I don't think it really gets through. And that is, I can't really frame it as a question, but the importance of shopping for a new policy. Because everybody, and I thought the same thing until I wasn't, believe it or not, I wasn't thinking when I was 5 that I really wanted to get into regulating insurance. I was like on the astronaut track there for a little while, right after the dinosaur track. But so you hear all the time, I've been with Allstate for 30 years. Or I've been with Allstate for 20 years. I've paid them, $40,000 over and so whenever I had my claim, they either paid it and then they non-renewed me, or they didn't treat me very well, or whatever it was. And I didn't mean to pick on Allstate, but I mean, really genuinely, I did. They were just the first one that comes to mind. But it's important to realize that insurance is, you don't have a 30-year relationship with an insurance company. You have a 1-year relationship with an insurance company over and over and over and over again, right? The 3-year rule the 3-year rule was kind of mess with that a little bit, right? Because you thought that, okay, I've been with this company for a long time, they can't cancel me. You are in a 1-year contract with them. They view you, it's kind of like a lease, If you have a good renter, in this case, a less risky policy, then you're inclined to want to continue, renewing your contract with that person. But if there are extenuating circumstances, the fact that they paid their rent on time last year doesn't really change the fact that you have to make a business decision, right? So it's important to keep that in mind. And so a lot of times you'll think that I have this relationship with my insurance company. I don't want to go shop my policy, right? I'm just going to stick with my insurance company. You can save a ton of money. And I want to be a little bit careful here, because over the past several years, if you live in South Louisiana, there was no shopping, right? So I'm aware of that. This is not a thing where you can just go out and find a new policy. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in situations where there's a healthier market, and we're getting there, and we've heard stories from people in the New Orleans area and further south over the past couple months, this is really a new thing. Mm-hmm. We're hearing people say, I went out and shopped my policy, I got a couple quotes, I got a handful of quotes, and I saved $1,500 a year. I saved $2,000 a year. And that's because insurance companies are competing for your policy, right? So all that to say, the importance of shopping around, I know that's kind of just like, oh, shop around, It's incredibly important to shop around. You are much more likely to save money by shopping around and finding a more affordable policy than you are by staying with your current company, because there's just no incentive for you guys are real estate investors. I don't know exactly if this is exactly in line with what y'all do, but I doubt anybody walks up to the person that's renting their property and tells them, hey, would you like me to lower your rent next year? Maybe you'll offer to keep them at the same rate, right? But usually you're not gonna go up and say, hey, why not? So shop your policy, and I mean that, and it's very important to do it. We have agent searches on the website, but that's the other thing. There are, they're called captive agents and independent agents. Captive agents work for one insurance company. Independent agents work with multiple insurance companies, but each independent agent works with different sets of insurance companies. Okay, so if you have a state all insurance agent, right? You're only going to get a quote for state all insurance. If you go to an independent agent A, he might give you 4 quotes from the 8 insurance companies he works with, but there could be 15 other insurance companies that you're not getting quotes from because you only went to this one agent. So what I'm saying is shop around. If you think that there might be a more affordable policy out there for you, shop around with a couple different agents. And I do it every year. I shop my policy every year. I do it for auto and I do it for home. I haven't saved money by shopping my policy around, but I have. Well, I say that. For example, I just renewed my homeowners in September. The company I was with up until that point was going to charge me. I live in Baton Rouge and I hesitate to say the premium because it sounds unfair. So I'm going to say they were going to charge me about 25% more than they had been charging me the previous year. So I shot my policy and I found a company that was about 5% more expensive than the current policy I had. So I switched companies. Believe it or not, I didn't get like a goodbye letter from the previous company. I didn't write them one or a thank you letter. It was a business transaction. But it's important. It's really important to do that. And I can't emphasize enough that if you do that, that is the number one. You don't have to go put a new roof on your house. You don't have to have somebody come out to your house and take a look at it, although that could be part of the process if you get a quote. It does not take much time, and you can even use the online quote tools, where you plug in your information, and that's better than nothing. So I strongly urge people to do that.
That's fantastic advice. I'm sure we have